The show starts with Nathaniel Fisher Sr., the owner of Fisher & Sons Funeral Home. He is driving his new hearse, happily singing, and smoking a cigarette. His wife, Ruth, calls and asks him to stop by and pick up some soy milk for their son Nate, who's coming home for Christmas. She then realizes that he's smoking and warns him that it could lead to a slow, painful death. Nathaniel dismisses her warning, tosses his cigarette out the window, and lights another one. Distracted, he doesn't notice a bus coming from his right. A terrible accident then occurs, leading to Nathaniel's death on the spot. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Ruth accidentally cuts her finger while cooking. Her other son, David, complains that buying a new hearse was a waste of money. Ruth defends her husband's choice, saying she'd rather have him spend money on a hearse than leave her for someone else, either a woman or a man. David looks visibly uncomfortable at her comment. The scene then shifts to the airport, where Nate is conversing with a young woman. They seem to hit it off, and she gives him a flirtatious suggestion to make out. The two then sneak into a janitor's closet, where they get intimate with each other. Back at the funeral home, David is organizing a viewing when his younger sister, Claire, rings his phone. She says she needs to visit someone before heading home for the family dinner. She then drives off to her friend's house. In the meantime, Ruth is in the kitchen, continuing to prepare the family dinner for Christmas. Just then, she receives a devastating call informing her that Nathaniel has passed away. Overcome with shock, she throws away everything in the kitchen. David hears the commotion and excuses himself from the viewing. He then finds her sitting on the floor, crying, and unable to do anything. David also goes into shock when his mother shares the tragic news with him. Meanwhile, Nate is still in the janitor's closet, making out with the mysterious woman. His moment is interrupted by a call from David, who informs him about their father's death. At the same time, Claire is with her friends, experimenting with crystal meth. When David calls her too, she promises to go pick up their mother Ruth and drive her to the morgue. In the next scene, Nate rides to the hospital with the woman he just met. She opens up about her family, revealing that her parents are both therapists who stayed together for the sake of their kids, and she also has a brother who struggles with bipolar disorder. Nate shares a bit about his own family, disclosing that he doesn't know his younger sister Claire very well since she was so young when he moved away. Elsewhere, Claire is driving their mom, Ruth, in the family's old hearse, now painted green. Out of nowhere, Ruth asks her daughter if she's doing drugs or having sex. She admits she can't remember the last time they talked about anything meaningful. Claire awkwardly assures her mother that she is all right. Meanwhile, at the funeral home, David meets a woman at the viewing he's managing. During their chat, it is revealed that David had dreams of going to law school, but with his father's passing, those plans are now on hold. Overwhelmed, he loses his temper and screams out aloud, startling everyone at the viewing. When Nate and the woman arrive at the hospital, she introduces herself to Ruth as Brenda Chenoweth. Ruth, shaken by grief, asks Nate to identify their father's body because she can't handle it. Claire then pulls away Nate for a second and admits that she's high on drugs. He tells her that while he's sorry she's having a bad experience, she'll have to pull herself together because he's the one who has to face identifying their father's body. Nate then enters the morgue to identify his father, but as he looks at the body, the morgue worker suddenly transforms into the spirit of his father. The spirit tells Nate that no matter how hard he's tried to avoid it, he's destined to join the family business. Here, we learn that Nate had left the family long ago in pursuit of his own dreams. When the vision ends, Nate confirms the body belongs to his father and joins the others in the hallway. Ruth asks Nate if their father's body will need a lot of reconstruction. She mentions that David isn't as skilled as Frederico, one of the funeral home's employees. Nate then takes a moment to thank Brenda for driving him. Brenda wishes him the best before leaving the hospital. In the next scene, Claire drives with Nate and Ruth on the way home. Nate feels she's driving recklessly and insists she pull over. Though Claire protests that he's not her father and can't boss her around, she eventually lets him take the wheel. Once they arrive at the house, David is seen waiting on the staircase. He becomes visibly upset when he learns that the family didn't bring their father's body back. He then drives off to the hospital to handle the situation alone. Meanwhile, Claire sits in front of the TV but she is visibly shaken. Ruth tries to comfort her by bringing her some food, but Claire refuses, saying she's not hungry. Arriving at the morgue, David is overwhelmed by grief while dealing with the arrangements. He pulls himself together and brings over his father's lifeless body to their funeral home to prepare for the viewing. The next scene cuts to a flashback, which shows a young Nate entering the funeral home's restoration room, where his father is working on a body. When his father offers him gloves to touch the body, he gets scared and runs away. Back in the present, Nate watches Frederico, one of the funeral home's staff, taking pictures of his father's body. Frederico shares that Nathaniel S.R. helped him a lot in life, and now he feels deeply indebted to him. David is also in the room but stays cold toward Nate. When David's phone rings, he steps outside to answer. It's a cop named Keith, who casually mentions he's making a rich dessert. David, trying to keep his emotions in check, quietly informs him that his father has passed away. Concerned, Keith asks if he can do anything to help. However, David is not ready to delve into the pain, so he quickly ends the call. Meanwhile, Frederico proudly shows Nate pictures of some of his restoration work, calling them his masterpieces. He also shares a photo of his son and mentions his wife is expecting another child. Later, Nate tries to lift Claire's spirits, and they head to the grocery store together. While shopping, he gets an unexpected call from Brenda. He jokes about her family's psychological quirks, but Brenda doesn't take it well, and abruptly hangs up. Meanwhile, Claire is still experiencing the side effects of drugs, leading her to break down emotionally and collapse into Nate's arms. The next morning, David is working on restoring his father's body using a wound filler. As he works, his father's spirit appears behind him, complaining that Frederico should be the one handling his restoration. David reassures him that Frederico will take over later. During this, he reveals his frustration over being forced into the funeral business by his father. Frederico walks in and notices David seemingly talking to himself. This leaves the latter feeling embarrassed and excusing himself from the room. Meanwhile, Nate goes for a run and notices a bus approaching. In his mind, he envisions stepping in front of it and reuniting with his father at the morgue for a surreal game of naked poker. The disturbing thought jolts him back to reality, where he is still standing on the sidewalk and contemplating weird thoughts. The next day at their father's viewing, Nate and Claire hang out together while David oversees the guests. Nate somewhat seems dissatisfied with his life and ends up shouting at a woman who offers her condolences. In the meantime, Ruth is in her room, getting ready for her husband's viewing. His spirit suddenly appears in his burial clothes and smugly tells her that he knows everything. Ruth is visibly shaken by his words, but she pulls herself together and proceeds downstairs to the viewing room. In the next scene, Keith arrives in his police uniform, but David doesn't seem happy to see him. Ruth, noticing the cop, seems worried. David assures her she doesn't have to worry about anything, and also introduces Keith as his racquetball partner. Later, Ruth becomes overwhelmed with grief, leading her to break down crying over her husband's dead body. David then takes her to another room to console her. Seeing them, Nate talks to Claire about the viewing tradition and questions the meaning behind it. He then shares about a funeral he once witnessed in Sicily where women mourned openly and intensely in public. Nate then joins his mom and his brother in another room to comfort them. Overwhelmed, Ruth confesses she had an affair with her hairdresser while married to Nathaniel Assar. She reveals to have met him at church. David is visibly upset by their mom's infidelity, but Nate is more understanding of her actions and comforts her. David later meets Keith to vent about his mom's affair, and we learn the two also met at church. Keith affectionately runs his fingers through David's hair, but David feels uncomfortable and tells him to stop. Claire catches a glimpse of their interaction and realizes that they are actually dating. At the same time, Ruth opens up to her son Nate about feeling ashamed of her actions. Nate comforts her, saying both his father and even God will likely forgive her. Just then, Nate's phone rings, but he is unable to answer the call. The scene then shifts to Brenda, who is holding her unanswered phone before hanging up. In the next scene, Nathaniel Assar's burial takes place at the cemetery, with everyone gathered around. As the casket is lowered into the ground, Nathaniel Assar's spirit casually watches from a distance. The ritual begins and David uses an earth dispenser to sprinkle soil over the casket. After doing his part, he hands over the dispenser to his mom and then his sister Claire. However, when it's Nate's turn, he refuses to use the dispenser and instead opts to take a handful of soil. He remarks on how the whole funeral feels too sterile and artificial. Ruth then follows his lead, grabbing soil herself and breaking down in tears. Nate comforts her and he also notices Brenda arriving at the cemetery. After the ceremony, Ruth leaves with Frederico while David, feeling overwhelmed, confronts Nate. He accuses his brother of only criticizing while leaving all the funeral responsibilities to him. We learn that David is still angry at Nate about how he ran away from home, leaving David to shoulder all the family responsibilities. After the funeral, Matt Gilardi from Kroner Service International approaches David, attempting to buy the funeral home. David angrily tells him to leave and walks away. In the next scene, while Claire chats with her father's spirit and discusses the perks of being dead, Brenda approaches Nate and gives him her phone number. She suggests he call her if he's ever interested in going on a date. Later, David, who is overcome with emotions, visits Keith's place. He breaks down and throws himself into his boyfriend's arms. The scene then shifts to a flashback, where a young Nate and David are seen playing outside their house while their father sprays them with a hose. Nate then suddenly wakes up from this memory and goes out for a run. Outside, he sees his father's spirit waiting at a bus stop. Nathaniel Sr. boards the bus and looks back at Nate through the window. Standing on the pavement, Nate watches people pass by and reflects on how everyone will face death eventually. The scene cuts to a pool party, where a man named Chandler Swanson pitches a scammy scheme called Beauty Vision to his friends. His wife also attempts to explain the idea to her friends, but it's clearly a pyramid scheme. As Chandler dives into the pool, something terribly goes wrong. He doesn't resurface, and this is when one of them realizes that Chandler's head is bleeding and he shows no sign of life. Meanwhile, David and Keith are cuddling in bed when David suddenly envisions his late father watching them. He becomes startled when his father reveals he knew about David's same-sex relationship with Keith. He then jolts back to reality and realizes it was all but a dream. Elsewhere, Nate gets a shiatsu massage from Brenda, who tries to uncover where he's emotionally wounded. After spending some quality time together, he leaves Brenda's place and heads home. That afternoon, David meets Mrs. Swanson, Chandler's widow, to discuss funeral arrangements. She describes her husband as dynamic and a lover of expensive things, like his BMW. David suggests a $9,000 casket, mentioning that it aligns with her grand image of him. However, it is later revealed that Mrs. Swanson turns out to be struggling financially, as her husband's company Beauty Vision never achieved any real success. Later, the Fisher family gathers for the reading of Nathaniel S.R.'s will. The business is left to Nate and David. Ruth gets a monetary inheritance, and Claire's college tuition is covered. However, no one is pleased. Claire calls it blackmail from beyond the grave, while David is pissed at his dead father for leaving 50% of shares to Nate, who never contributed to the business. Afterward, David puts Nate to work and sends him and Frederico to collect a body, since Nate now owns 50% of the business. They go to a nursing home and transport the body on a stretcher. Frederico leaves Nate alone with the body when he receives an emergency call from his pregnant wife. While driving, Nate gets a call from Brenda, who invites him for a quick lunch date. He cannot refuse the offer, so he casually drives around the body in his van and meets Brenda. It becomes too late when he realizes that dead bodies can smell when left out in the normal temperature for too long. During dinner, David and Nate argue about the condition of the body and how much it can cost them if it were mishandled. Ruth interrupts them and scolds David for being too harsh on Nate, as the latter is just starting to learn the way of business. David gets upset and criticizes his mother's relationship with the hairdresser. Struggling to contain her emotions, Ruth slaps him and abruptly leaves the dinner table. Meanwhile, Claire and her friend Gabe are smoking in a van. It is clear that she has a thing for him. Taking advantage, Gabe asks her to suck his toe, and Claire reluctantly agrees. The next day, Ruth goes hiking with her hairdresser friend, Hiram, but confesses that their relationship feels like something out of a sex channel. Hiram suggests they go on a trip to the Bahamas to cool their minds. However, Ruth has come prepared as she says goodbye to him and their short relationship. After returning to her funeral home, Ruth finds Mrs. Swanson in the slumber room attempting to steal her late husband's watch. We learn that Mrs. Swanson was unaware of her husband's dark secret, as he made her believe that they were filthy rich. In reality, her husband was a total scammer and owed money to multiple organizations. Now that he is gone, she wants to take everything that's left of him to survive. That night, Nate goes over to Brenda's place, and they spend some time together. This is when Nate notices a tattoo of his name on her back. However, Brenda assures him that he is not the only person who is named Nate. The following day, Nate attempts to sell a used casket to a rude customer, which is both illegal and unconventional. Although both David and Frederico are against this, the customer goes along with the deal as he is short of money. Later, Matt Gilardi from Kroner Service International approaches Nate and shares his company's desire to buy out the funeral home. Unlike David, Nate believes selling their business would actually do good to their family. They can finally pursue their dreams. Additionally, Kroner Service International is pitching good numbers for the buyout. The positive expression on Nate's face shows he is willing to sell his shares to the multinational company. The next scene shifts to Hossman's all-natural bread company. An employee named Thomas Romano is cleaning the inside of a large dough mixer. Sadly, he is met with a tragic accident. His assistant, distracted by a bug on his hand, accidentally activates the machine, leading to Thomas being gruesomely chopped into pieces. The last words Thomas hears before his death are his teenage assistant asking if anyone has ever had sex inside the mixer. The Fisher family soon handles the body parts and prepares them for the restoration process. The next morning over breakfast, Ruth is growing increasingly frustrated with David's constant complaints about the funeral business, and she's also disappointed that he hasn't been soaking his oatmeal. Nate then announces his decision to sell his shares to Kroner, and this only angers David. He lashes out and blames Nate for invalidating his lifetime's effort. Later, Claire and Gabe have another intimate evening involving toe sucking. However, the following day at school, Claire finds her car vandalized with cruel phrases like little piggy lover and toe slut. In retaliation, she finds the severed foot of Thomas Romano at home and places it in Gabe's locker. This act of revenge soon leads to trouble at school. Thankfully, Keith steps in to help clear Claire's name by confronting Gabe. Claire then thanks him and reveals that she knows he and David are gay. In the next scene, the Fisher family prepares for Thomas Romano's open casket viewing. Due to the missing foot, Frederico uses a lamb's foot to replace it. He then warns Nate and David to keep an eye on the widow, as she might try to climb into the casket. As expected, the widow breaks down and decides to join her husband in the casket. To make the situation more complicated, the daughters also join their mother. When David and Nate rush to stop them, they reveal that they are only curious about the shoes Thomas is wearing. To everyone's surprise, the missing foot appears perfectly intact. Frederico then reveals to them that he used the lamb bone from a meat joint found in the freezer, ensuring no one would notice the difference. Later, Matt Gilardi visits the Fisher funeral home and informs Nate that Kroner has purchased the rundown property across the street. Gilardi reveals that Kroner plans to turn it into a funeral home that will compete with the Fisher's business. However, when Claire later returns home after speaking with Keith, she tells the family that the house across the street is on fire. Everybody rushes outside, stunned by the sight. It becomes clear that Claire set the house on fire to solve their family's problem. The episode concludes with a woman walking her dog near an overgrown patch of land. When she calls for him, the dog suddenly appears, holding Thomas Romano's missing foot in his mouth.